Hey y'all. So I released this song, Barely Listening, a few days ago, and I had some people hit me up with like excitement and questions about some of the sounds on it and how it was recorded. And in a way, it was actually recorded very simply, but I'm really, really satisfied with the process and how it came out. So I thought this would be worth diving into a little bit and maybe I can answer some of the questions this way. And I also thought it was kind of cool because I've been doing these one-on-one like production and tracking and engineering and mixing sort of like lessons. So I think this is like a little bit of an insight into like how I communicate and how I can help like unpack stuff and kind of like talk about processes to like get to the bottom of sounds we hear in our head or how I have accomplished um, getting certain sounds. So yeah, so I think the song I want to talk about the approach a little bit first because it's a song I had written. I'd worked on it a bit with my friend Natalie on some of the lyrics, and it had kind of been sitting for a year or two. And I listened to it, and I was like, I would love to try a version of this with the band that we was the band for the full length that I released last year, and that is Samir on drums, Max playing keyboards and other instruments, Evan Dibbs playing anything with strings, and then Mateo playing bass. And we actually tracked this at Mateo's studio near my house, which is cool because it's not a space I work in a lot. So it felt like already like some excitement and like danger to the process because it's just like a little unknown. So it was fun. So as far as the approach goes, I really really wanted to try and go for a final like version of the song, or I was trying to find a process that would lead to a final version of the song that felt like roomy and a little smeared and like raw and rough around the edges and connected and just very like human and not doctored up and manicured as can be so tempting and easy to do when we record things digitally. And I think part of that was I knew that I'd have to create some limitations almost to just sort of trick ourselves into not micromanaging, because I think as musicians, like, we want things to be better and perfect intuitively. So trying to find ways to keep that energy at arm's length, and it's there if we need it, but we can really just be present and think about the song feeling good. So what I did was I never sent the song or a demo to the other musicians. They are all tremendous musicians, so I had full confidence that we could arrange it that day. But I just played it for them on an acoustic guitar. We talked a little bit about like some ideas about how we'd approach it, and then we all just kind of started playing together to kind of figure out an arrangement for the song. And everything you hear on the recording was made up that day. I mean, even the my guitar part, I had just been playing like cowboy chords when I first wrote the song. So that was really fun and created like an immediate sense of like, yeah, this is good, let's roll with it, because we have only today to make this song. And I think that ended up being a really positive catalyst for a lot of the like bold and quick decisions we were making. So yeah, we did that. We arranged the song, and then I think once we kind of got to an arrangement that we were happy with, I think we were sort of recording everything. I think we did a few full takes of it, and most of what you hear is from that full take. I think there were a few overdubs. There was a tambourine. There was a tiny banjo moment. I think we tried banjo in a lot of places as an overdub, and I kept it in one or two little places. And then I recut the lead vocal. I think it was I intended to sing the lead vocal as we did the live takes, and I had the mic, and I think I did sing some cues and scratch vocals, but the guitar part that I developed I think was just too challenging for me to execute the playing of it and sing the song. So I went back and sang the vocal, but in keeping with the ethos of like sort of like let's not overthink this or micromanage everything. I only did full takes and of the whole song on the lead vocal, and I think I kept the second take. And it was really cool because we'll get into it when we talk about the tracking a little bit, but like I was just messing around in the room in some of the larger instrumental gaps, and some of those things ended up being like kind of some of the sounds on the vocal overdub that are not singing ended up being very identity driven and helpful for the song, which is cool and kind of a happy accident. And then there's also one harmony in it that Matea's song is an overdub. But other than that, the main instruments were all live. So that was sort of the approach. So how I want to break this up is I want to talk about the tracking and recording of the song as sort of like part A. And then I mixed it. So then we'll talk about mixing and tweakier, mixier stuff separately. And I think that that'll be cool to sort of separate those things because that's a little more accurate to the process. Like this is where we at when we made it, and this is where I was at when I sort of finalized decisions about the mix. So let's talk about tracking the song. We'll start from the ground up. There were 5 musicians that played live. So the first was Samir, who's the drummer. Samir is in just about 900 bands and is currently a very sought after drummer for very good reason. He's an incredibly sensitive musician. I love playing music with him, and he is, you know, one of the kindest humans if you've met him, like, on earth. So a great vibe, great to be around, and unlike me, he's the only one that took some pictures, so we can talk a little bit about the drum setup from Samir's pictures. So here, this is the kit that Samir played. I think these are Mateo's shells. I'm not sure what the make of them is. They're like kind of vintage drums, you know, kick floor rack. No front head on the kick drum. The snare is, I will put it in the comments, but the snare is or in the description. The snare is Samir's snare, and I don't remember the model, but these are Samir's cymbals. There's like a Paiste Masters in there, and yeah, that's sort of what you're looking at is what the setup was. And in terms of miking it, this is something I came in with an idea for. I really wanted to mic it minimally, and so we did. And then, so we have one kick drum mic, which was important for kind of getting the impact that we were envisioning on the kick drum. It's just this 47 FET here, not too far away, nothing mind-blowing happening about that. It was, the preamp was a Cappy VP26 that the monitoring in the control room was a little new to me, so I was kind of making some bold decisions flying blind, and it is a bit saturated. Like I'm crushing the front end a bit and trimming down on the preamp, so that kind of like distortion just kind of became an inherent part of the kick drum sound, which was fun. Now the cool part here is, I don't know if you can see this, but yeah. So this was Max's land over here where there was a whirly. There was a B3 set up, but we ended up not using the B3. We just, at times, Max played this MS-20 like mono synth through the Leslie of the B3. And then the whirly was playing with the speakers on, so the whirly was audible in the room. And then Evan sat over here where he played an acoustic guitar through this Shure ribbon mic, and I was over here singing and playing my DI guitar. But the only other 2 mics on the drum set other than that kick drum mic are these 2 Coles 4038s, which are ribbon mics, and they're bidirectional figure 8, meaning they hear what's behind them equivalently to what's in front of them. And I think these moved a bit after this picture, but they were measured to be equidistant from the center of the snare, just for phase reasons, about 6 feet away each one. And my hope was that this mic would be hearing the drums, obviously, that allows things in the room, but the rear part of the pattern would also be hearing the whirly speaker, and the rear part of this pattern would be hearing the acoustic guitar. So you do have 2 kind of like overhead or kit mics on the drums, but they're also miking 2 of the other instruments in the room, and I was just hoping that would create some stereo smear and glue, and like the bleed would become something that leads to that product that, you know, we were seeking with the approach. So let's listen to that. And it's a lot of me talking right now. Let's listen to that. So I'm gonna play the three mics on the drums, and then I'll solo, and you can kind of hear what I'm talking about with the bleed and with the kick drum being a little distorted. So here we go. Interesting, right? So I think the bleed wasn't quite as loud as I envisioned it. I envisioned it like maybe like 60-40, 60% drums, 40% the instrument that's near the mic. I think it's probably more like 80-20. But it's cool, and you will see when we start blending the tracks, the interactivity is like crucial. That when you mute the overheads, it changes the way those other instruments sound. Like I think rather dramatically. So I think it was successful. It just maybe wasn't quite exactly how I envisioned it in terms of how bold the bleed would be. But let's. So I want to go through all the instruments that were played live first because they are what we were hearing when we were making the song. So I'm going to skip the tambourine overdub, even though it would be kind of like next in my order of like drums, percussion, bass, guitars. So we'll talk about the bass. The bassist was Matteo De Benedetti of Charlie and Margot fame, and yeah, he has become a really incredible bass player, and he didn't really play much bass when I first met him, so it's been cool to kind of like ride along on the journey with him. But he played a vintage P bass with flat wounds, and he was in the control room running Pro Tools. It was his studio, and I really wanted to be in the live room with everyone, especially with just having to focus on singing and playing. So we DI'd him through a tube DI that I brought, and that was how the bass was captured, and that's what we were hearing. I don't think there was any compression to tape. It was just like pure DI. And then I did reamp it when we got home. So what we're hearing now is the reamped version. It was reamped through an Ampeg Portaflex, like a B15 flip top, and it was mic'd with an RE20 through a 1073. Pretty straightforward, all nice stuff, but like pretty straightforward signal chain, like P bass, tube DI, B15, RE20. Nothing experimental about that process. But I think the real triumph is the interactivity of the choices Matt made as a bassist with what the drums do. So first I'll play a little bit of what the bass sounds like. Sounds great. Cool. You hear that it's flat wounds. You can hear that it's being played with a pick. I love that sound. It kind of has that like mid-range barkiness to it, but it's not the zingy, bright round wound string thing that can just be a whole other vibe. It feels a little old, and the B15 and the tube DI, I think the saturation and the gain staging of going through those things does so much work to make it feel even. A P basses can notoriously have like louder notes on the low E string than the A string, and sometimes you have to kind of fight to make it feel even or resort to like compression. But I think that like when we get into mixing, we'll see. But I'm not compressing this very much at all, or at all. I don't think this ever touched a compressor. So the evenness of it is coming from both the person's hands, Matt's hands, and then kind of like a couple stages of it being saturated and sort of glued and evened out. So, but like, what I want to do is I want to listen to the way Matt's playing the bass with the drums. He also makes some cool choices in some of the verses. The progression for most of the song, I think, I'm not sure what key it's in, ended up being in, maybe E flat or E, but it's a one chord, a major two chord, and then a four chord twice. That's kind of most of the song, other than the choruses. And Matt made the choice at certain times to just pedal the one, like the root. By pedal, I mean leave it over these changes, and it creates sort of interesting inversions. And that was a really cool choice. And then the big thing is the way Matt's using the length of notes. Short, long, short, long, short, long. It interacts with the drums in a way that creates a whole new movement. That like those two things now become one feeling. And I don't know if there's any of y'all that record music out there, listening to that way, just soloed, the drums and the bass, I think might be challenging because they're not perfectly lined up. They're not to a grid. The bass is often a little bit behind the kick drum or the drums themselves. And I think that's one of the big things I've found works against me. When you microscope stuff and you start to just listen to things soloed or in small groups soloed, and you're like, it's not perfect, it's not tight. And it's like, no one's going to hear the song with these things soloed. So if it doesn't feel right or doesn't feel perfect enough for whatever your goal is in the context of everything, then sure, maybe then it's time to get into some editing or whatever. But like, because I think this is a cool artifact of the process, because we never really listened to anything soloed when we were playing. We were just like, there was at least two guitars, keys, drums, and bass happening. All that we could really hear was the way they all worked together, and that feels good, even though it's not perfectly lined up, or it feels good to me, and it felt good to us. And I think that's a critical component of why the song sounds the way it does. Probably more than the mics and more than the choices in terms of how we recorded the instruments. It's the way the musicians interact with one another and the imperfect things that give it identity and allow you to hear the personality and the choices of those people playing. So yeah, huge fan, and like so impressed by the way Matt and Samir grooved on this song. And I, definitely listen to the whole song and you can really hear everything about how they interacted. But I'm just going to kind of keep going through these basic tracks, because and we'll kind of add them to one another. We can solo them to hear some nuances, but we'll add them and hear the way they interact. So the next thing would be Evan's guitar. Evan played an acoustic guitar, and I think at some point when we were arranging it, we decided to both capture it with a microphone, which was the microphone that we saw in Samir's picture here. It's this Shure 55, I think. No, Shure 330. Yeah, it's a ribbon mic, pretty old ribbon mic. I have it up here. We can take a look at it. I was doing some vocals with it, but it's this guy. It's got a cool swivel. It mounts right to the mic, just like some old school type shit. But it's cool. It definitely, to me, behaves like a ribbon. It's on the warmer side, and it's needs some gain. But I think it's a very focused ribbon mic, and I feel like it has really nice mid-range to it. And we'll listen to it in a second. But just remember that a big component of the way the acoustic guitar sounds is also the bleed of the acoustic guitar in that like right kit mic of the drums. So here's that mic for a second. Let's just check it out. Okay, so there's a lot of drum bleed in his mic as well. It's a back and forth. But here's the intro where there's no drums. You can kind of hear it. So by the end, when the drums are rocking, it's like more drums than acoustic guitar. And maybe that was why we made this decision to also take a DI of the acoustic guitar, and that DI was running through some kind of overdrive pedal, and I think a slap delay. So let's check that out. So here's the same guitar, same part, but this is just the DI track. Yeah, it sounds like there's also a reverb or something, or maybe it was just the delay doing that. But so here's the two of them together. I love like parallel saturation and distortion. It kind of creates more of a 3D thing where you're hearing like the mic, hearing the air, and the like actual super high frequency stuff of the strings being picked. But then you get this kind of like gritty, really dense mid range from the saturated track. So let's check out now just the three things we've covered. So this is the bass, the drums, and that acoustic guitar. Yeah, also doesn't, needless to say, Evan's an incredible guitar player. So his choices and his phrasing and these little licks and the sort of like, Evan really leaned into the plan and the approach of like, I'm going to treat this like somewhat improv, like with improvisation as a big part of it, but still in a not overplaying way, in a way that serves the song, but keeps it feeling a little loose. And it looks like we did make a big move here with some editing. I think we just muted the guitar for this ring out. And I'm pretty sure that was a mix move, so we'll get into that later, but it was just to make room for a little whirly lick. It just felt a little too crowded there. But so that was not the full take. There is one tiny moment that's been muted. So then there's my guitar, which, and the guitar Evan was playing, I don't know if I know exactly which guitar it was. It might have been my Waterloo. I'll find that out. So the guitar I was playing was this guy. It's like an old Harmony with gold foils, and I think it sounds really cool, but like mostly it was about the fact that it was tuned to open D. And as we were arranging the song, I kind of like was really vibing with the way the voicings in open D worked. So that was kind of just like a utilitarian choice. And the way it was captured is kind of like the opposite of the drums and acoustic guitar, with bleed being a whole thing. I really was interested in DIing the electric guitar, not with the purpose of reamping it, not with the purpose of it being like for safety or using a plug-in amp, like more to like dive into and try and celebrate the sound of a DI, which is just as valid of a sound as anything else. I think we forget that, or I forget that a lot, because you think of a DI on an electric guitar in particular as being like a functional tool to like either having a way to reamp it later, or like, use some kind of amp sim or something. And like, I think the sound of a DI is really unique and cool. It doesn't sound like an amp. It sounds like its own thing. So that's it. And there's really nothing very much, even when we get to mixing, happening to my electric guitar. It is just DI'd. I did use a really cool DI, so we'll talk about that. That's this guy, which is the GB Tracker by Undertone Audio. I just brought it in the live room and plugged straight into it, and it's a really, really cool piece of gear because it actually puts out line level, so you don't need to plug the DI into a preamp. And it's on top of that. So it was made to have some really, really, really incredible functionality in terms of interfacing reamping with tracking, and it has a whole ability to gain match the input and output for reamping. But I was just using it for the DI part of it, which maybe wasn't necessarily how it was intended to be used. But I got to they were nice enough to send me one to demo a year ago when I was making a record with a band, and we just ended up falling in love with the sound of it. It's just super high clarity, very tight. It's the most beautiful sounding DI I've ever heard, and I was like, this is its whole own thing. So for this song, I was like, I want to try having my guitar be just through that DI. So here's a bit of what that sounds like, and then I can play you everything together. And I do want to say, just for Undertone Audio's sake, that bit of clipping you hear when I play real loud and rake that chord, that's something I'm adding during mixing. That thing like does not clip if you leave the correct amount of headroom. I wanted to add a little more messiness to it. Yeah, but we'll get into that when we talk about mixing. But yeah, it's pretty just like there. And it was cool to be able to hear the DI'd signal while I was playing, because it allowed me to like be like the idiosyncrasies of not being through an amp and it not kind of responding the same way. It changed the way I played the guitar totally. It would have been very different if we had some kind of amp sim on, or I was playing through an amp, I'm sure. But let's just check out the two guitars and the drums and bass, maybe in the instrumental section. And it's cool. It's interesting. We're already just with those four instruments, it's starting to become smeared feeling. Like it's hard to totally make out exactly what each thing is, which sometimes might not be a goal, but for this song was like, felt very successful, and felt like something we were really going for. So that those four instruments were played live. And then the last thing we'll get to in terms of what was played live is Max's stuff. So Max Connery played keyboards. Max plays a lot of instruments and sings great, and is in a band called Sonic Bloom, and is just like a powerhouse musician that we are all constantly just surprised in new ways at how sensitive and like and how much care he's able to participate on whatever instrument he's playing. So he's always a great time to play with and collaborate with. But he played two main sounds on the song. There's just a Whirly, like a Wurlitzer A200, and instead of DIing it or running it through an amp, we mic'd the speaker on it, and the speaker has its own kind of sound, and it overdrives, especially when you turn it up enough. So we just wanted that sound, not like an amp or anything. Used a cool mic for that, which I'll grab. It was this guy. It's like a Western Electric. I think some people refer to it as a salt shaker mic. Western Electric 633A. It's real cool. It's a dynamic mic. It's very, very mid-range forward, and I felt like it was gonna, without any EQ, already bring out the things we wanted out of that Whirly speaker. So let's check it out. It's basically just smashed right up on the Whirly speaker, so there's not much bleed in it. pretty driven. Obviously, the tremolo, which is the only other knob on a Wurlitzer, was engaged with some authority. Sounds great. Max is a great player. Um, and then, kind of for other parts of the song, we had messed around with the B3. We had that set up, and we had the Leslie mic'd. I think it was just with 257s. It was in a basement somewhere. There's still some bleed, but we ended up taking out an MS-20 like mono synth, which is Max is great with synthesizers, very experienced, and the MS-20 is a synth that he uses all the time. So it was just fun that he could really quickly get to a really like evocative sound. But the MS-20 was running through the Leslie. So let's check that out. And Max was manipulating the speed control on the Leslie. So the Leslie went from slow to fast, which is a whole thing. If you're, especially if you're listening to this on headphones, you can kind of hear they're panned left and right, the two mics on the Leslie. It's really like kind of swooshing around. And I could be wrong. Max can comment and correct me on this, but I'm pretty sure for that instrumental part we just listened to, there's two oscillators on the MS-20. So I think Max is just holding one note and allowing the one oscillator to stay static, and the other oscillator, he's changing the frequency of the oscillator and sort of, instead of playing note changes like this, playing note changes by changing the frequency of the oscillator. So Max is holding one note on the synth, and the melody you're hearing is sort of the second oscillator gliding. If you listen closely, one is the same and the other note is moving around. Which is neat and like inevitably going to be a little imperfect and out of tune because you're just kind of like feeling it out, playing it like a theremin or, you know, a fretless instrument. You're just using your ears to tune it. And that was a really, really special sound that's really important on the song. But let's listen to a little bit of like the bass and drums and the keys and kind of hear how he's interacting with everyone. So we got like... Pretty cool. Some more whirly stuff. Yeah, and just like when I was talking about the bass, like there's so many choices that everyone is making that we didn't even have the ability to dissect and sort of like judge ourselves or each other on because we were just playing the song a lot. But there's so many cool musicians. Like the song is a celebration of all the people who played on it and their choices because there's really not much getting in the way of that, and there's no editing really. So it kind of leads to, it's all steps that because of like some intention and limitations we put on ourselves and everyone really getting behind the vision, we got to, just because of sort of like this set of rules we had made in terms of what we were chasing and trying to stay away from self-criticism and criticism of each other. Yeah, so that's all the instruments that were recorded live. We could talk real quick about the few overdubs. Yeah, so there's a tambourine, which Samir just went in after we got the take and played the tambourine all the way through. I think it's unaccented completely, and then it goes double time at the end, but we'll check this out. It was just through one of the two Coles mics. I don't remember which one we turned on. I think we had taken one to do the lead vocal, and maybe it was the right one was left there. So Samir just sat on the drum throne and shook the tambourine. But here's the tambourine. Yeah, and it's cool. It's not perfect either, and I think that's percussion instruments that you use for like ostinato timekeeping type stuff, like a shaker or tambourine or anything that goes like. I think when those are looped or perfect or made to a grid, in my opinion, it has a huge effect on the feel as opposed to it being performed, especially it being performed like uniquely throughout the whole song. I don't think one's better than the other, but they are very different. And I think a lot of like old records we listen to that we just like, how did they make that feel so real and like glued and human. I think a big part of it is just that it had to be a performance on a lot of those old records because there wasn't the ability to just like grid and loop it and like um but I think that's a whole different thing than if Samir just played 4 bars and we looped it. um but it's a good sounding tambourine through a cool ribbon mic. There's nothing tremendous about the way it was captured. A lot of it has to do with the performance. Then there was a little bit of a whirly overdub in the instrumental. We just Max really didn't want to, but I wanted him to play just a few little licks to interact with this banjo idea that we were messing around with. So same whirly, mic the same way, just a little. You can see in the session, it's just a few little licks in this section. And then there was the banjo overdub, which we just used the same mic and DI. So the distorted DI that Evan had been playing the acoustic guitar through, and the same mic he'd been playing the acoustic guitar through. It was a banjo. Just started playing a banjo. And same thing, just trying to develop this instrumental section to feel a little more collagey. There was no vocals there, so it just felt like the live tracking didn't quite have enough keeping your attention to have it be like a 32 bar instrumental. So there's a few banjo. And here's kind of those two overdubs and how they interact in the instrumental with a little more stripped down of a background so you can hear them. Awesome. It's hard to make out specifically what those are doing in the final mix, but I think that was kind of the point. Like they're just kind of adding some smear and some licks. And then the one other thing we kept, I think Evan tried playing from there out the rest of the song, and I think he was the one to even be like, "It's too much. We need to not have it be happening all the time." And I was like, "Fair." But at the end, I did leave in just the distorted track of him sort of rolling, meaning like the doo dabu doo ba doo dabu doo ba the Scruggs banjo thing where you kind of hemiola play a bunch of notes over and over again. Pretty cool. And Evan is fantastic at I don't know, he has a very unique thing, especially on banjo, where to me when he rolls, the voicings he chooses just it feels like such a familiar and old school technique, and it evokes such a familiar and old school like Appalachian folk banjo sound, but the choices of voicings feel not tied to any sort of like historical dogma on how to play the banjo. They add color and have a lot of non-chord tones, and I think that part was just like too cool not to keep in there a little for the texture of it. Okay, so the last two things, as far as the tracking goes, we're down to the vocals. So right off the bat, Matt had a great idea where we wanted to kind of celebrate the room. And I think at first I was like, well, I'll be kind of far away from the ribbon mic when I sing the vocal as an overdub, and we'll compress the shit out of it and you'll really hear the room. And I think it just created some interesting things that we didn't like. So we ended up putting one mic closer to me and one mic further away from me and capturing them both. One is sort of a more direct sound and one is sort of a more room sound. And you can see here in Pro Tools, I automated them quite a bit in the mix. So you're hearing more of the direct mic or more of the room mic, depending on what part we're in. So in the intro, there's more of a room mic blend. This is going to be painful to listen to.
Drunk like a school kid on a Saturday night. A fucking freak show. Been solo. Ears are ringing and I'm hitting a stride. A beautiful.
You can hear some bleed from the control room, actually. And there is a slap delay on the dry, closer track, so that's influencing it a little bit. We'll talk a bit about it. That was a mixing decision. But here's a version of it with no room mic. Oh, yeah.
2 summers since I've hit the ground. I'm just a sellout because I bought it.
And you can still hear the room a bit, like it is a figure 8 mic and it's hearing the room, but in the parts where there's more room mic, you can really, really hear it.
The drive home I finally found now.
So here's a fun thing we kind of landed on. I got a little bored waiting for this really long instrumental. I was attempting to hum along with Max's synth part. Not a great performance, but in there, and I was just using a lot of the room mic, just adds a little bit to the gluing chaos. And then at one point I started doing this. And if you listen closely in the song, that beatboxing is actually a big part of the rhythm, and it interacts with the tambourine and the drums quite a bit. And then there's Mateo's harmony, which was just through the same setup, a close mic and a far mic, and used a good amount of, almost all the far mic, just to make him feel like the harmony was sitting a little behind the lead vocal, but here, so.
I wanna tell you what I'm talking about, but I'm having trouble and I don't wanna let you down. Feels like dying to be waiting around when I'm barely listening.
Matt's a great singer and can sing real high, so that was we thought about putting harmonies elsewhere, but it really, when we tried different things at different points, it just felt like that was the only part that really benefited from it. And yeah, so that's all the ingredients to bake the cake, basically. Like, that is everything that we recorded that day with our approach. And I think we probably arrived around 10 or 11 a.m., set some stuff up, started jamming around noon, and then around 6 or 7 got the live take, and by 8 or 9 had been done with all these overdubs. And then I mixed it, which was also a really quick process. But yeah, thanks for listening to all this. I hope some of it was interesting. I'm going to make another video that I'm going to post probably in a couple days, and it's going to be about sort of like how all these things were finally attached to one another and balanced and realized and mixed to create the final version that you hear. But I think that even just from hearing this, you can see that, like, I would say 85% of the song that you hear was accomplished during the tracking. And that was really awesome. And it also was really liberating for the mixing. It felt like I didn't feel like pressure to fix or overthink anything. So yeah, thank you. Hope this was interesting.